To make this video because it's a common misunderstanding that people think that if their turbocharger is not performing well or not, it doesn't feel like there's a turbocharger on the vehicle. They think, well, the turbo needs a rebuild, but that's commonly misunderstood, and most of the time that's not the problem. And then you go and rebuild the turbocharger and you're stuck chasing your tail because that didn't fix the problem. In this video, I'm going to go through and teach you all the things that you need to check to determine if your turbocharger needs a rebuild. If you do have an issue where the turbo doesn't feel like it's there or performing correctly, the first thing that you need to do is to do a boost leak test. I have multiple videos on how to do that. I did one on the 6.0 Power Stroke, and I did one on the 7.3 Power Stroke. The 7.3 was one of my trucks, and then the 6.0 was one of my customers' trucks. I also ran into the same issue with the 6.7 Cummins with a local guy. I wish I got a video of that, but I didn't. So check those videos out that I did. It's very informative. Once you have determined that the turbocharger will hold pressure in the system up to 30 pounds of boost and will relieve itself over about a minute's time frame, then you can move on to determine if the turbocharger is the issue or has an issue or needs a rebuild. The first thing you want to do is take a look at the turbocharger, make sure there's no damaged fins and no oil coming out of the compressor housing. One thing to keep in mind, if you do have oil coming out of the compressor housing, it could be coming through the crankcase ventilation, which usually has a one-way valve in it that connects to the intake before it goes to the turbocharger. So if that is leaking the oil passing into the front of the turbo, that could be it could confuse you what the issue is. If you have it set up to where you know the oil is not coming through that one-way valve, you could have a catch can to know that you don't have oil coming from that crankcase vent valve. Then you could determine that if it's leaking oil out of the front of the seal of the turbocharger. The next thing you should do is take your hands and check it for side-to-side shaft play. It should nearly hit the housings, but not quite. If it's getting so close that it nearly looks like it's going to touch, it likely has too much shaft play. Then another thing to check is check it for in and out shaft play. You can push it in and back, or push it back and forth. If it has back and forth movement, usually that means that the thrust bearing's gone, and a lot of times when that happens, oil's coming out the front of the turbo and the back of the turbo. When it moves in and out, that means that it's wearing out the piston ring seals as it's doing that. Another way to determine if your turbo needs a rebuild is if you're getting oil blowing out the exhaust system of the vehicle. It would be a whitish blue tint. Keep in mind it could be blowing oil, but it could not, in some cases, not be the turbocharger that is causing that. It could be coming out through the cylinder head or the piston rings. So with the cylinder head, there's valve seals inside of the cylinder head. If those are worn out, oil could be leaking past those valve seals, or oil could be leaking past a broken piston or worn out piston rings. The way to determine that is to remove the turbocharger and look at the inlet of the turbocharger and see if there's oil here, and also look at the outlet to see if there's oil here. If there's no oil here, that usually eliminates the possibility of oil burning from the engine side and means that's coming from the turbocharger side here, which you need to determine why it's coming out the exhaust side. In some cases, the turbocharger could still be good when the oil is coming out the exhaust side. In that case, it would be an issue with the turbo not being able to drain out the oil effectively, and where it gets blocked up in the cartridge and is forced out the seals. In that case, you need to fix the blockage problem and then clean up the turbocharger and reinstall it. Most of the time that fixes the problem. If not, you could have damaged something internally inside the turbocharger and it may need a repair. The way to determine if the turbocharger needs a rebuild is if it's whining really loud. If you read on the forums or online, a lot of people say it sounds like a police siren. that means that the journal bearings are too wore out, the tolerances are loose, and the turbocharger needs a rebuild because of that. There's a couple different scenarios how it could get that way. I've seen some turbochargers that have over 500,000 miles on them that still have the proper bearing to housing and shaft clearances, so they didn't need those parts. But other ways that it could get worn out is usually from not having changed the oil on time. Sometimes people have the issue where they restrict that turbocharger, but they shouldn't have. A lot of times that happens when the oil drain is not big enough, so the turbocharger is leaking oil because it can't get rid of that oil. So people put a restrictor to compensate, but they don't realize that they restrict it so much that the turbocharger is not getting enough oil to keep it lubricated. Another scenario with a factory vehicle where that could happen is it's really common with the Subarus. They have 3 filters inside the cylinder head. One of those filters is right before the turbocharger, and because of that, if that filter gets clogged up, it can restrict the oil pressure going to that turbocharger, and it will cause it to have very loud bearing whine. A lot of times when it gets really bad or really clogged up, the turbochargers will go bad within 100 to 200 miles just because the oil cannot get to that turbocharger to keep it cooled and lubricated well enough for it to last, so it causes the bearings to wear out excessively because of that. One scenario that I had with a customer was he didn't replace the O-ring on his oil feed line for his BMW, and because of that he put RTV silicone on the oil or on the O-ring, and he installed that. Well, what happened because of that, it had a piece of the silicone come off and go and stick inside the thrust bearing hole, and when that happened it blocked off the oil pressure to the thrust bearing and it caused his turbocharger to whine. That concludes this video. In summary, if the turbocharger is not making any strange noises or is not leaking oil out the front or the back of it, it's likely still good. The way I would pursue this problem if it's not making any power would be to do a boost leak test. That's all for this video. I'll catch you guys later.